Okay, William, thank you very much for coming again. We are delighted to have you and your very informative presentation. It's always wonderful and very helpful. So the stage is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Harry, very much for having me once again. Today I'd like to talk about an article which I just prepared for the Epoch Times newspaper. I don't know how familiar your listeners are with that newspaper, but I'm quite impressed with its reach. Currently, it's published in 32 countries of the world in, I think, 26 different languages. And as it happens, because its operating mandate can be put in two words, truth and tradition, it tells you that it's largely a true conservative newspaper of record, and there aren't many of those left. Most of them, I'll give you an example, like the New York Times, have gone far left. Now, the New York Times used to be a newspaper of record for much of the English-speaking world, but my friend Lowell Cohn, who worked for them for 22 years, was here visiting me last week, for a week, and he just lamented. He said it's terrible. It's become a leftist rag, all because of a change at the top in the governance of the newspaper. And, of course, we see that if we look at the New York Times articles. At any rate, Epoch Times seems to be a bit of a grassroots response to that sort of turn of the tide in what used to be good newspapers. Almost all of them are going left. So that's a little preface to say I wrote this article for Epoch Times, and it's coming out this weekend in hard copy, and it was posted on their website about 5 days ago, I think about 5 days ago on their electronic website. At any rate, because I can't, the topic is wokeness, a new religion, ? So the article is asking the question and trying to answer it. Has wokeness become a new kind of religion in the Western world? In order to make sense of this case, I'm going to read you the paper because I can't say it any more clearly than I wrote it. And I worked hard to make it as clear as possible. So let me begin. And what I'm going to do is interject from time to time and comment on my comments if necessary, just for further clarity. So it begins like this. Civilizations tend to repeat the ideological pattern that made them strong in the first place. Now that itself is a statement about history and the origin and development of all political ideologies. So take note. At first, these patterns have theological form and substance, but if belief in God becomes obsolete, which arguably it has in much of the secular Western world, they tend to continue the same pattern in secular form, but minus their original religious substance. To visit my neighbor's home at Christmas is to enter a palisade of tinsel, baubles, winking lights, and lots of little reindeer and elves running around, some of them like, motorized. But there's no hint of Christianity to be seen. No Christian cross, no Star of David, no images of Christ. You would have no idea if you were from some foreign country that didn't know anything about Christianity. You'd have no idea if you walked in this house, what he was celebrating. Except it looks very nice, and everybody feels happy to see the light show and all that. So that's what I mean by saying they tend to repeat the ideological pattern, even though God is obsolete. And now I want to just talk about a little spiritual history which develops this theme. For 2 millennia, the Christian nations of the West have been nourished and deeply inspired by the expectational vision and promise expressed most notably in the book of Revelations of a perfect 1,000-year kingdom of heaven to come with the return of Christ. That promise has supplied a deep Western psychological wiring, so to speak, that operates to this day and is plainly heard in the words of the Lord's Prayer, which end with, "Thy kingdom come." Little kids repeat the Lord's Prayer, and their minds get filled with the idea, of the coming kingdom, "Thy kingdom come." That vision of a perfect future world got really fired up politically in the Western world by the prophetic end-time scheme of a man named Joachim of Fiora. He was a 12th century Italian monk who taught that all history can be divided into 3 ages. The first is the age of the law and the Father, which is like all pre-Christian history, which he said was a time of fear and servitude. The second is the age of the Son and the Gospel, which he describes as a time of faith. And the third, yet to come, is the age of the Spirit, which is the second coming of Christ and the perfect 1,000-year kingdom of heaven. Now, mille in Latin means 1,000. Hence the label millenarian as a descriptive term used by historians for believers in the kingdom to come. A complete history of the fanatical religious movements, enormous mobs of distraught, wild-eyed Taborites, Hussites, adepts of the free spirit, Anabaptists, and so many others who wandered all over Europe enthralled to one or another prophetic vision of personal salvation through faith in the kingdom, is fascinatingly laid out by Norman Cohn in his landmark study, The Pursuit of the Millennium, published in 1957. And wow, what a book. If you read it, your perception of Western spiritual history, at least, and ideological history, will never be the same. Now listen to this. He describes Joachim's third age as an egalitarian time of love, joy, and freedom in which, and I quote, God would be revealed directly in the hearts of all men, unquote. Directly. It was, he adds, and I quote again, the most influential prophetic system known to Europe until the appearance of Marxism. So here this eminent scholar is drawing the link for you from Joachim in the 12th century all the way up to the appearance of Marxism in the 19th century, and telling us here that, as he does in his book, that Marx was just a millenarian in drag, in secular form, so to speak. Eventually, this specifically European prophetism found fertile soil in America, where it was ecstatically expressed in at least 4 continent-wide Great Awakenings. They were called Great Awakenings even then. And this, I submit in this little paper, was our original form of wokeness, at least in the North American world. And these happened from the mid-18th century well into the mid-20th. The first was sparked in 1741 by a preacher named Jonathan Edwards, who in a famous and fiery sermon pointed his accusing finger at what he called, this was the title of the sermon, sinners in the hands of an angry God, quote unquote. He inspired belief in a deeper piety and a higher standard of personal morality in hundreds of thousands of people. This specifically American kind of spiritual awakening eventually took original and sometimes fanatical root in the form of at least a half dozen, newly invented American religions, specifically American. They were not invented in Europe or Asia or anywhere else, such as Seventh-day Adventism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostalism, Southern Baptism, and a few others, fascinatingly explored by the culture critic Harold Bloom in his eye-opening book called The American Religion, written in 1991. It's really a great read, and again will open your eyes as to the what am I going to call it? The flourishing of these kinds of beliefs in modern times, especially as rooted in American history, from which they spread. I mean, we can find all kinds of these people in Canada and in Europe and England and so on now. Now I want to talk about some disastrous recent history, which I think is an echo of the themes I've been explaining to you. By the early 20th century, however, following the catastrophe of World War I, God was increasingly deemed an abject moral failure, and he got kicked out of the building, especially by millions of disillusioned, grimly atheistic university graduates emerging from the fever swamps of higher learning. By this time, the soft liberal democracies of the West had been on a path to extensive secularization for more than a century, which, of course, has just been continued like a tsunami. However, the old wiring remained. If God is really dead and gone, went the thinking, then we have to create the kingdom of God on earth by ourselves, without God. And this is called the secularization thesis. It's about, I mean, it's not original with me, although I do like to write about it. It's about the secularization of the militarian urge in Western man. How the wiring has continued, if not the true spirituality. So the possibility of a perfect secular world soon became the ideological objective of a lot of Western thinkers, but especially of the most vicious modern dictators prepared to liquidate millions of their fellow citizens to achieve it. Soviet International Socialism, which we call communism, and German National Socialism, which we call Nazism, became the two most prominent European promissory visions of a perfect, socially just world, an end which they justified by any means, as we know. When in 1996, after the fall of the USSR and its long history of unspeakable cruelty and the slaughter of so many of its own people, the Russian Communist Party, believe it or not, was attempting a comeback by electoral means, not by dictatorship means, but at the voting booth. At that point in time, Time magazine asked a Soviet general named General Makashov if they had anything more specific in mind than restoring Soviet power. And now listen to what he said. He replied, quote, "What is our maximum program? The kingdom of God on earth, or communism, as we call it, before the third millennium," unquote. Well, that was in 1996, and I tell you, that just fell into my hands. For a fellow writing the kind of essay I'm reading to you now, he just fell into my hands. There he was, citing the kingdom of God on earth and the third millennium, like it was Joachim Fiore in a communist hat with red stars. That's what it was. Meanwhile, in the middle of the long communist debacle, Adolf Hitler directly plagiarized Joachim's entire historical scheme, minus God again, for his National Socialist, get this, Third Reich. Now, what does Third Reich mean in German? It means Third Kingdom, which he boasted to the world would last for 1,000 years, directly out of Hitler's speeches, and echoing Joachim Fiore again. And that's what I mean by saying the wiring is still very much in place. It's also in place, by the way, with less dictatorially minded political leaders when they serve up what I call promissory political visions to their people before and during elections. This is what we're going to fix up. This is what we're going to make perfect. We're going to create the Great Society, the Just Society. The Great Society, I think, was Lyndon Johnson's term. The Great Society was Pierre Elliott Trudeau's term. I mean, what they're all trying to do is label their vision of a perfect world which they think they're going to bring about. And that's because they're mostly left liberals, if not dictators, who think it's possible to modify human nature by law, as we said in one of our last talks. Whereas the true conservative said, no, hold on. Don't ruin the good by aiming for the best, because you may destroy it. We're not doing so badly, but we are failed human beings. Perfection is not possible for individuals, and therefore it's not possible for any government, including yours, sir. So stop preaching about the perfect kingdom to come when you know damn well it's not possible, at least not on earth. Meanwhile, in the middle of I already talked about that. He called it the third kingdom, which he boasted would last for 1,000 years. And that's what I mean by saying the wiring is still very much in place. Both of these tyrants were following the same centuries-old Western wiring to create a social system so perfect, as the poet T.S. Eliot remarked so insightfully, that no one would have to be good. And now what's the implication of that very interesting comment by T.S. Eliot? Trying to create a system so perfect that no one would have to be good. It's like they're hung up on the idea that we can avoid the agonies of human choice and the agonies of self-correction by creating a perfect human society. And then you won't have to worry about being good because everything's going to be good. You can see what an idiotic dream that is and what a false promise it is if you know the least thing about yourself and your own imperfections and the least thing about, say, raising your own children or dealing with your friends. At any rate, the next question I want to lead to, having given you that background, which I think is important because it takes it right from biblical times through Joachim of Fiora, through the disastrous dictatorial regimes of the 20th century up into our own time. So now the question I have to ask you is, and I do see other articles coming out now all over the place on this very theme. Is this woke world that's being shoved down our throats, in fact, a caricature of Christianity? Could our present fevered, and I'm calling it a great awakening, be a new secular form of Puritan revival rooted in the divinity of various group identities such as gender, race, sex, class, color, and so on, instead of an individual identity? Does group identity now signal a secular salvation separating the saved from the unsaved? It would seem so, for we are daily subjected to a myriad of public confessions of group guilt, to the public cleansing of historical group sins, and to a social justice gospel empowering believers to sniff out previously hidden sin in themselves and others. The unwoke, the modern unwoke, and I don't know how far this has gone in Israel, Harry, but it's all over Canada now, and it's all over the U.S., as I have said, and if it's not where you are yet, it's certainly going to be. These people are sinners in the hands, that's us, the unwoke, that is. We're no longer sinners in the hands of an angry God. We are sinners in the hands of angry Puritan reformers preaching the urgent need for a global reset, which is code for the overthrow and the remaking of Western civilization in its entirety. And there is more. Wokeness comes with its own rigid orthodoxy, and transgressors are considered heretics to be punished immediately, beginning with public demands for penance. For example, check your privilege, like drop it, the casting out of demons, for example, cancellation and deplatforming of public speakers. And of course, the insistence on the public right to disturb and instill guilt in large crowds of the faithless with shows of personal piety by taking a knee, as they call it. Finally, as in former periods of religious public madness and delusion, the remedy for sin is forced confession, recantation, and self-purification of all inherited microaggressions, as they like to call them, with the goal of liberating unwoke souls from slavery to their own spiritual blindness, and that you and me, that is. And then come the ceremonial defacings and the violent mob destruction of statues and paintings of unwoke Western heroes. This is a direct replication of the Puritan smashing of Catholic idols and saints and altars in the 17th century, where they went into the churches in places like Leyden and Holland. You can see them. I've been there. You walk into these churches and you see the broken and smashed faces on these statues or images of past Christian saints on the walls, smashed with sledgehammers by Puritans who felt, what? They weren't pure enough, puritanical enough. Well, meanwhile, civic employees are roaming all over the place, renaming streets and public institutions to purge them of any association with past sin, and also to clear out all unwoke books from libraries and schools. I mean, that's going on every day. I don't know what you're reading, but we read it in our newspapers every day. And there is some reaction. Some parents are getting upset, but they're overwhelmed. They get labeled unwoke. They get fired, lose their jobs in universities or as teachers in the public school system. Like the enemy is everywhere. And right now, at least, you can't do much about it, and not much will be done until the whole society stands up and said, drop it, folks. You know, we've been through this before, and we don't want to go through it again. What about the question of global wokeness? Well, the new woke catechism has global ambition, and there are suspicions it is but the cutting edge of a coming transition from traditional soft Western socialism to a hard totalitarianism that is being accelerated with the help of sweet-sounding, if confused, ideological tools. The most radical of these, at least in Canada, is called EDI, which stands for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Now, this is a soft Marxist initiative dividing the whole world into oppressor versus oppressed classes that has already spread like wildfire into every government office, media outlet, digital platform, and corporation in the land as an established faith, and it may be seen in documents such as, quote, global diversity, equity, and inclusion benchmarks, colon, standards for organizations around the world, unquote. So you see there we have international documents. Soon they're going to get latched onto by the United Nations, and countries are going to be asked to sign treaties or whatever with the United Nations that they're going to adopt the woke program. I tell you, before it ruins us, you better figure out what's going on, and I'm trying to help you do that right here and fight back.
William?
Yep.
Can you please break down the EDI? What does it really mean?
It means equity, diversity, and inclusion. So people who use that term, it's just something they've come up with in the last year or so, and they use it to as a kind of standard, egalitarian standard for all organizations. For example, they want equity, and it's a confusing use of the word, I'm afraid, because in fact, equity has to do with what is deserved, not with equality. You know, so they don't mean equality. You see, we already have equality before the law and equality in the eyes of God and all that. They don't mean that. When they use the word equity, it's an intentional confusion of the public mind who think it's just about being nice to everybody, treating everybody the same. But it's not. Equity is about what is deserved and what these people are doing, having already divided the world into oppressor and oppressed groups. And that's the main structural reality everywhere it's used. What they're really doing is saying, we want reparations, we want money, we want to be paid back. I'll give you just a current example. In Canada, the Pope Francis just made a visit to Canada, and this past weekend he was at a Indian, or what we call Indigenous people gathering. This was a gathering of Indigenous people who still feel that their races were, tortures, beaten, raped, killed, or whatever, by teachers and priests and nuns in the Catholic school system that was set up in Canada in the 19th century, and it went until about the late 1960s, to help Indians. They were called Indians then. I still call them Indians, and they called each other Indians, to help them learn to speak English, help them understand the larger society around them, help teach them trades like woodworking, automotive repair work, or even more advanced academic work if they were suited for it. Many of those Indians did graduate from those schools. I mean, there were a couple 100,000 of them anyway, maybe more, over a 150-year period, who graduated from those schools, and went out and became very successful citizens of Canada. But at least half of the native population, Indian population of Canada, still lives on what we call Indian reserves. These are special places in the country. There's a few hundred of them, maybe, I don't know how many. But Indians who don't want to go out and take their chances in the outside world, they live on the reserves where they pay no taxes. They get all kinds of free government services, free medical care, free whatever. I mean, it's unbelievable. And Canada, I think, is spending close to $30 billion a year to give them what they want. That's a lot of money. However, a few years ago, they started to get upset about the residential schools, which, as I say, were primarily run by Catholic priests and nuns, but also by some Anglican organizations. I happen to know a fellow. He's a good friend of mine. He worked in one in the far north of Canada, up around Inuvik, which is way up in the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle. And you know what he told me? He said, Bill, it's all nonsense, these criticisms of our schools. We did not go into the native reserves and take children away from their parents and force them to be educated in our schools. He said, most of them were brought to us by their own parents, who begged us to take them, even when we were full and could hardly handle it, taking any more. Sometimes the kids would wander in from the forest, all covered with mosquito bites and black fly bites, and emaciated and hungry and dirty. He said it was absolutely incredible. And we loved looking after them. We would wash them, bathe them, clothe them. Yes, cut their hair, because usually they had lice and that kind of stuff, and give them clean clothes, and then get them into class where they would learn something, which they were never going to learn on the reserve. And the reason was most of the parents, especially the fathers, they wanted help out trapping. So how the residential schools in Canada came to be was that the government had dictated education for all children, and it built actual schools on these Indian reserves, but nobody came. They couldn't get the students to come to these day schools because they were out fishing and trapping with their dads, most of them, and all that. So they built residential schools, like what we call boarding schools, and they went to live there. Now, some of them might have been a couple 100 miles away from the reserve, but they would transport them back and forth. They'd go home for the summer, come back in the fall, and all that. And as I say, some very successful Indians have come out of that system. However, today it's being seen as an oppressive system. And in fact, currently there's a scandal going on. Somebody used what they call ground penetrating radar and said that they had found graves in an apple orchard right beside a residential school out west. Well, as soon as that got started, oh my God, they've been murdering children and burying them at night in the graveyard in the apple orchard, like unmarked and all that kind of stuff. As if something really terrible was going on. Well, they found about 220 graves. And over the 100-year period in which that school existed, there were terrible bouts of cholera, diphtheria, pneumonia, and flu, and all kinds of things like that. And at least 2 children every year died at the school. So the school would bury them. somewhere. But as it happens, not in the apple orchard. So to date, this is like 3-month-old panic story now. No one has found a single body in that ground-penetrated study of the apple orchard and so on. Mm-hmm. And most of the crosses which they put up to mark those graves have rotted ever since, and they're gone. As for getting the poor children who died home to their parents, sometimes their parents were 300 miles away, and the school couldn't make special trips, like for one poor dead child. So they would probably say to the parents, come and get the body. Parents would say, bury him, you know. And so they did. Anyway, yes. The Pope was here apologizing to all of Canada's Native population for the scandal of the residential schools. And I hate to be cheeky with the Pope, but I have to tell you, he doesn't know the least thing about it. You think he would, but he doesn't. And if he knew something about it, he would have said hundreds and hundreds of Native students graduated from these schools and became thriving members of the greater society. Some of them, of course, were poorly treated because sometimes human beings poorly treat each other. But that was not endemic to residential schools. It was just part of what happens in human life, even in open public schools, which are non-Indian schools. So we apologize for anything that happened. But he should have praised the good work that he did. Now, wouldn't you know, this political issue has become a real bone of contention. And the government got into it and created something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And they have forked over, I don't know how many billions of dollars to any Native person who came forward and said, I had a bad time there. They strapped me or whatever, you know, hit me or whatever it was that he says. But these were not courts. No evidence was required. All you had to do was go forward and say you didn't like being at the school and you were mistreated. And suddenly you got a check for $30,000 in your hand. You know, I'm making light of it, but it more or less was that easy. No evidential proof was necessary in order to be paid off if you could prove that you were in fact a student at that school. Anyway, I'm going on too far afield here, but the word equity is being used by social justice warriors and woke people to imply that there's an oppressor class and an oppressed class. In this case, the priests and the nuns and the greater society and the poor Indians who were abused by them. And now, in the woke world, there's always an oppressed class. Always. They just assume that there's always an oppressed class, no matter what they're looking into. And then all they have to do is identify the oppressor. Well, who are some of the other oppressors? Anybody who's white, anybody who's male, anybody who believes in a patriarchal society, anybody who believes in the traditional family where, generally speaking, you know, the father has a role just like the wife does, but he tends to have the last word when it comes to any family crisis. Oh no, that's oppression and so on. All feminists will point to all men as oppressors of the female sex. And, you know, this is endless. Of course, color and race. I have a very dear black friend I've known for 50 years. And we were up at my cottage one day and he said, Bill, how do you feel about your privilege? He didn't say white privilege, but he said, how do you feel about your privilege? And I said, I love it. And I think I've earned every bit of it. And he looked a little stunned at this reaction. I said, how do you feel about your black privilege? And he goes, what do you mean? I said, well, I see you have a Rolex watch on your wrist. You live in $1 million home and you drive a really nice Japanese Lexus car. I call that privilege, whether it's black or white. How do you feel about that? You know, he just went quiet because he got caught out. It was pretty easy to do. But so much for the word equity. It's a loaded word meant to impose guilt upon some oppressor class or other, and that's why it's in the phrase. The word diversity is put in the phrase equity, diversity, and inclusion because these people resist the notion that nations exist, that dominant races exist, or anything like that. And they call for diversity in everything. They want to mix it up as much as possible. So multiculturalism is a policy which has grown out of that call for diversity in human societies. Now ask yourself, how did this happen? I mean, the American dollar bill still has on it the Latin words "e pluribus unum," which means from many, one. In other words, from diversity, we want unity, not the other way around. And listen carefully, what I always say in criticism of these people, but sometimes they're too slow to catch on, is that you can have diversity within unity, but you can't derive unity from diversity. You see, because once you start pushing diversity, unity is gone. Well, if unity is gone, what's it mean to have a human society? What's it mean to have a family? What's it mean to have a nation? Well, I'll tell you what it means. You get people like Justin Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau's son, running around boasting that Canada is the world's first post-national state. What he means is that Canada has no identity. It's just a diverse collection of people, churches, restaurants, food, whatever. It's not a nation anymore. And of course, if you see the immigrants flooding illegally across the U.S. border, you would kind of nod and say, well, the U.S. is fast becoming not a nation anymore. Because if you can't control your borders and, 1 or 2 million people jumping the queue and just running across the Rio Grande River in Texas to get into America where they get everything, free dental care, free food, free schooling, whatever, having done nothing, and abusing the millions of people from all over the world who've applied legitimately to get into America, who watch them on TV and say, what the hell? I've been waiting for 2 years to get my application processed, and this guy just walks in. Well, these guys, this hordes of people walking into America, and they become citizens right away, and I don't? I'm still waiting? There's something wrong with this. And of course, that's true. Anyway, so much for the word diversity. I want to close on that word simply by saying that diversity is about the destruction of unity of any kind. Okay? Because they assume that if you belong to some unity, you're an oppressor of all those of us who are diverse. See, like the unified patriarchal family, the unified nationality of the nation. Any kind of unity is an oppressive force when it comes to anyone who doesn't belong to whatever it is they happen to be criticizing or who is not part of that social group. Now, inclusion is just kind of a tack on, but it's not just a tack on. It's another radical aspect of the phrase equity, diversity, and inclusion. What it implies is that whatever organization you're running should be an exact participatory reflection of the surrounding society. For example, I don't know why they stop there, but they say we want 50-50 men and women legislators in Canada's parliament. 50-50. Right now it's about, I don't know, I'm guessing 80-20 men versus women. Well, the freedom lover would say nothing stops a woman from becoming a politician. She can run for politics. She can try to get support from her neighbors. She can campaign just like the guys do and try to get elected into parliament. Why are we supposed to feel badly if more women aren't doing that? Like, it's ridiculous. What we want is the people who want to do it, who want to represent us and want to improve things, whatever. And we don't care if they're men or women, and you can go on about this forever, but I mean, the diversity folks assume a kind of underlying, unspoken egalitarian principle. All shall be an equally and participatory reflection of the surrounding society. So if Canada, say, has 5% black people, I don't know what the percentage is, it's something like that, then 5% of the people on your corporate board or in your bank or whatever should be black people, or in your university or whatever, or Jewish people or Germans or Lithuanians. They don't actually go that far. They mostly focus on what they consider to be the oppressed races and classes and sexes of individual. And they want any organization you're looking at to be a reflection of the surrounding society with respect to those groups. Okay, so I think I've explained now what equity, diversity, and inclusion means.
Yes, thank you very much.
Watch out for it in Israel. If it's not there, believe me, it's going to be.
It's already here to a certain degree, maybe more than I like.
Well, you watch. It's going to grow. It's going to grow because, well, why? Because Unfortunately, it's true that about 80 or 90% of all citizens of the world have a gripe. They gripe about things. They complain about things. They feel they were hard done by. Life didn't work out the way they wanted to when they were younger. And here they are, doing whatever they're doing, and they hate it. I'm not saying everybody, but a lot of people. And so these kinds of grievance philosophies are wonderful for people like that. And that's why they spread so far and so fast, you can't do much about it. Because everybody who has a grievance is grabbing onto these kinds of slogans and clamoring for that sort of world. And guess what? I hate to say it, but a lot of, I'm only picking this group, but there are others, Black people, for example, in America, a lot of them are getting into universities they ordinarily would not get into if they just wrote the application test like everybody else. And now there's an uproar, of course, because as it happens, Asian students in places like Harvard and Princeton and Yale and, I don't know, Stanford, where I went to school, are doing way better at the application test, like they're scoring in the 100% range. A Black guy comes along. I'm not saying all Blacks. There's some brilliant Blacks, obviously, but there's just not as many of them. For example, if you go to downtown Toronto and you pick out 1,000 Black people at random and 1,000 white people at random and 1,000 whatever, Jews, say, at random, you're going to find that, again, I'm just picking a number, but let's say 200 of the Black people will have an IQ over 120, which is pretty high. But 300 or 400 of the white people might have an IQ over 120, and 500 of the Jews. Jews tend to do better in academic institutions than, say, ordinary Protestants or Catholic white people do. I don't know why. I just think they're smart folks, and they work hard. What people want to do is change those almost ineluctable ratios and get a proportional reflection of the surrounding society. So some guy, this is just coming out now in the research, sociological research, Black kids who are applying to places like Harvard, I mean, first of all, what I'm thinking is, why aren't they applying to a junior college or a less prestigious university? Anybody who applies to Harvard is asking to get into a elite institution. But if they don't really believe that they're among the elite, or if they don't really believe that they can do work of that caliber, they should apply somewhere else. Water seeks its own level, and so does intelligence. And so you're just a bloody fool if you have ordinary intelligence and have only done so-so work in high school, and you go applying to Harvard. Well, Harvard, I'm picking the institution, they're all doing this. Harvard gets going and says, we don't have enough Black students at Harvard. They apply, they don't do very well on our entrance exams, so we have to do something about this. Well, we're going to do some affirmative action. We're going to say, this is how they get away with it, and around the law, by the way, we're going to say that diversity of the student body is good for the university, not good for scholarship necessarily or whatever, or good for science or math or whatever it is a certain group is not doing well at. They just say it's good for the university to have balance of ethnicity on our campus. Why would we want the same ethnicities running around, So under this rubric of good for the university, they introduce policies of affirmative action. And what they say is, say some Black kid applies, and he's not one of the Black kids who did really well and got in on his own, but they still don't have enough Black students to reflect the surrounding society. They say, here's a wonderful young man, and he very well may be. I mean, he plays the guitar. He's a great basketball player. He's a wonderful human being. Let's just get him in, and we'll help him as much as we can and see how he does. But forget his entrance exam. It doesn't matter that he didn't score very highly on the exam. We want him because it's good for the university. And that's how affirmative action is tended to squeak under the standards in these universities. Now, unfortunately, and it's only coming to light, and it's being brought to light, by the way, by some brilliant Black scholars like McWhorter and Thomas Sowell and people like that. Boy, there's just some real dandy, very bright Black conservative political thinkers out there. I can send you a whole list of them if you're interested, because they really do good work. And what they are saying is, this is not so good for our people, that you're hiding the truth and you're getting people who are not up to it into very prestigious universities. And once they start doing the classwork and going to the lectures and having to turn in papers, they tend not to do very well, and so they drop out. And it damages them personally, maybe for the rest of their lives. Oh, God, I was a failure. Oh, God, I couldn't cut it, and all that kind of stuff. Why are you encouraging a situation in which people who are a cut below the top level, only of a normal IQ as opposed to some genius IQ, which is what you're asking people to have, why would you lure them into your university on false pretenses? Well, I think that's a very good question, and it's a sympathetic question, because what it's trying to ask is we shouldn't be harming these people by misleading them. You know, if they can make it. And by the way, I have helped a lot of young black men in my life who are all fatherless when they came to me, and I was a part-time track and field coach, and I just loved helping them out. Some of them I even tutored, got them through high school, and then I found university scholarships for them as track and field athletes, and they've all graduated. The last one went to Berkeley, for heaven's sake, and graduated from there. I felt great about that. You know, it was wonderful work. So I think if you really want affirmative action, what you should be doing is trying to help people become better instead of lying about the fact that they're not better yet. You know, that would be far better and more honest for our whole society.
Yeah. And
anyway,
William, would you agree that if we are going to take the next step of diversity and inclusion, then those Ivy League universities are going to be filled with 12% of black people, and presentation of the same percentage of the ethnic diversity in school? Yeah. So that's going to be the result?
Well, they're facing it now. They're having a terrible time with it. And who's making the biggest protest is the majority of Asian students at Harvard are suing the university for not allowing them in, because a university can only take, say, I don't know, I'm guessing 25,000 students, I'm guessing. So this guy is Asian and he applies and he's 25,001, and he knows that he's done way better on the entrance exam than 4,000 minority students who got in through affirmative action, and he sues the university and says, what are you doing? You bumped me and kept me out in favor of some kid who's not even close to doing as well as I did on your entrance exams. So it's causing a tremendous fuss. And it's Asian students primarily who seem to be especially gifted, I don't know why, at the sciences, the mathematics, the physics, and all that kind of stuff. Maybe they don't do so well, at English literature or history or whatever. They tend to focus on the STEM sciences, engineering, math and physics and things like that, where they blow everybody out of the water. They're the ones who are complaining about, guess what? Reverse discrimination. You're discriminating against excellence in order to bring in mediocrity, and we think it's wrong. It defies the entire principle of a meritocracy, which of course it does. But that's what EDI does, and that's what that slogan, equity, diversity, and inclusion, leads to everywhere it's tried. Even where they say, oh, well, we're just going to publish it and say it because we think it's nice. But no, it ends up contaminating the output of their organization, whether it be scholarship or a corporate product. Or, heaven help you, if a hospital starts hiring people on the basis of EDI, and you need brain surgery, I know what you're going to say when you walk into the hospital and someone introduces you to a black doctor. As wonderful a human being as he might be, you're going to be anxious, because you're going to say to yourself, did he get in here on affirmative action? Did he not make the cut? Was his work not as good as the other doctors? I don't want him operating on my brain, thank you very much. Wonderful guy, but keep him away from my brain. That's what even the most leftist political thinker is going to say when push comes to shove, when it comes right down to his operation, his brain, whatever, or his child. Yeah. That's the kind of thinking which it just comes out of the woodwork. It's normal human thinking.
Yes.
And by the way, Canada has about 250 minorities. But if you open and I have nothing, as I say, against black people, one of my closest friends is a black man, and I've been helping young black men all my life to succeed. But you would think the only minority in Canada was black people. You open our newspaper, and every second page has a photograph. If it's a group photograph, there's always going to be a black guy or a black woman in it. Never a Lithuanian or a Nicaraguan or an Estonian, or any of the other minorities who are in this country. And I think that's because of white guilt. The whole white society feels guilty for slavery. And as a result, it feels it has to make up by featuring blacks in every damn ad that comes along. And they're completely irresponsive to criticisms, for example, some of which I think are quite humorous, like the Toronto Raptors basketball team, which won the NBA last year or the year before, I can't remember. They're all black players, and they're all American. There's not a single Canadian on the team, even though it's a Toronto team. Not a single Canadian, not a single white guy, and no other race either.
Yeah,
well, no one says, why don't you apply EDI to the Toronto Raptors basketball team? How do they get away with this kind of, let's call it, racial selection? When you don't get away with it, if you're trying to staff your coffee shop with people who look like you, you're going to get hell. But the Toronto Raptors can staff the whole team with 35 wonderful black basketball players, and they get away with it. Well, people go, well, but that's sport. That's sport. Of course, the merit principle has to apply, or we would lose every game we ever played. But anyway, I'm just alerting your listeners to the fact that EDI is the formula. Now, Americans sometimes turn it around and they call it diversity, inclusion, and equity, because that acronym spells the word die. And they're saying that die is killing off our open society. And I think it is. And I'm almost going to say it's too late, because I don't know how we're ever going to stop it. Maybe now I should continue to finish my little paper here.
Yeah.
So I did mention anyway that it's everywhere, including in world organizations, and a lot of nations are going to be asked to sign agreements and treaties to sign on to EDI. In order what? To get grants, to get money. Universities will not hire you unless you sign on to EDI. And you have to do that in Canada with what they call an attestation. Now, an attestation is a statement which you sign as a incoming faculty member, that you will support the principles of EDI, not only at the university, but in your personal life. So they're starting to dictate your personal behavior outside your workplace. My son-in-law is a brilliant legal man. He's a prosecutor, has a brilliant legal mind. And there are 60,000 lawyers in my province called Ontario. And they were all asked by their society to sign that attestation that they would support EDI principles in their work and in their legal thinking and in their lives. And he just had a fit, and he organized a resistance to it. And thank God they won, because they changed the whole board. They threw them out and put a new board in. But it doesn't mean the new board isn't going to do it sometime soon. So, citizen action, what we call grassroots citizen action, can be effective in that way. But the question is, for how long? I'm afraid that when whole societies become inebriated on these expectational visions of the third kingdom, whatever you want to call it, and they use slogans like EDI to get themselves there, you got a job, because you are fighting the wiring of the Western ideological system. So I'm going to go on and say that superficially, EDI is a powerfully attractive set of egalitarian notions aiming for the proportional reconstitution of all institutions according to the proportions of human beings in the surrounding society at large, according to exact ratios of sex, gender, race, class, and so on. Evidence for failing to achieve exact proportionality, for example, 50-50 men and women on all corporate and public boards, which is the rule in Canada now, is searched out in every act of public, private, or, get this, unconscious opinion. And all institutions are judged guilty until proven innocent by woke purveyors of EDI who have purified their own thoughts sufficiently to judge and condemn the fallen and the sinful with an irritating confidence. They really are irritating. Western wokeness began in American universities. It quickly spread to Canada and is now invading Europe to the chagrin of such as President Macron of France, who has publicly warned of the moral plague of American universities. That's what he called it. And prior to the Ukraine war, President Vladimir Putin of Russia warned the West. He did this at a well-known intellectual conference called the Valdai Conference in Russia. It's held every year, and they invite speakers from important people from all over the world to speak on a variety of topics. And he spoke. It was actually a very good, moving speech in which he warned the West that communist Russia had already embraced and destroyed itself with exactly this kind of blindly doctrinaire wokeness. Exactly what you're doing. He said, don't do it. So my next section of the paper asks, do we have a new caste system here? In an extensive analysis, author James Patterson points out in an essay he wrote, it's a long and good essay called Wokeness and the New Religious Establishment, was published in a journal called National Affairs in the summer of 2021. He said that wokeness is, quote, the virtual opiate of the elites, unquote. And he asked, has it already become a new state religion? For until conversion to wokeness, citizens are assumed to belong to what has been described by some critics as a lower, maximally unclean caste, because they're born into privileges like whiteness, masculinity, heteronormativity, cisgenderism, capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, and so on. If you are any one of those groups and more, you're part of the unclean caste of human beings who are walking around. And so they must engage, these people, they say, must engage in endless acts of atonement, not expected of the caste of the blameless clean. And the clean bear a myriad of oppressed identities. So they're almost proud of their identities. You even see some prominent American women politicians claiming that they're Indians, for example, or black, when in fact they're not, and they get outed. Someone asks them to prove it, and they can't. But they want to belong to a clean, oppressed class of identities. Refusal to acknowledge and atone for your caste privilege makes you an untouchable. So, for example, when I said to my friend that I was proud of my privilege, right away he thinks I'm an untouchable. And if he weren't such a good friend, he wouldn't have laughed. So anyway, this writer, James Patterson, adds pointedly that the hiring of diversity, equity, and inclusion administrators at public universities to oversee the production of clean identities is akin to those universities hiring priests or rabbis to oversee adherence to Catholicism or Judaism, unquote. But, he goes on, America and many other Western nations have strict constitutional laws prohibiting the promotion of religious belief in public institutions, schools, and universities. I'll give you an example in Canada where it's very overt in the province of Quebec. There's 10 million Canadians living in the province of Quebec, and they have a policy there called laïcité. Laïcité means secularism, basically, and they forbid you to wear any religious garment or head covering or symbol in a public institution if you're working in it. You can walk in with one on and ask for service, but if you work for that organization, you can't wear any of that stuff. Same in public schools. If you're a teacher, if you want to have a Christian cross around your neck, you don't wear it outside your sweater, you put it inside where nobody can see it. Because they figure that if you're wearing the yarmulke on your head or the Christian cross on your dangling on your shirt, it's a form of religious advertising. You want people to know that you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim or whatever it is you are, or Hindu with your turban. You want them to know. So you're advertising religion in a secular society, and it's banned. And so anyway, this is the case in a lot of modern societies where there are constitutional impediments to that. So, Patterson says, if the new woke liturgy currently disemboweling educational and institutional life throughout Western civilization is ever judged a religion by the courts, as was an atheistic belief called secular humanism, by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1961 American case called Torcaso versus Watkins. That was a case where the humanism, I guess people had complained it was being taught in the universities, and it's a religion. And the humanists said, no, it's not a religion or whatever. Maybe they did want it to be a religion so they could get the financial benefits and the tax-free write-offs that come with being a church or something. But the U.S. Supreme Court said that even though there's no God to which they pray, it's in fact a religion. And if that is the case, the court said, and what Patterson says, then all public institutions, quote, preaching belief in the divinity of group identity in a woke faith community and in a moral code grounded in the struggle against oppression may sooner rather than later be in for some big legal and funding surprises, I should say. Anyway, that wraps up my paper and my talk about it. I hope at least some of it got through and that you enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it very much. I'm sure the members did as well. Would you allow us 5 minutes of questions?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay, so I actually have two questions. One question is, how do we reverse the boat, and if it's too late? And the second thing, which is a little less related, but related to you being the hero that you are, protecting the family and conservative thought, what would you say to young men who are saying that the best way to go about in relationship is by having open relationship and being polyamorous? So those two questions, if possible.
Well, starting with the last one first, I think that true human love cannot be, true human love is a union of two souls, and it cannot be spread indefinitely beyond that. So I think polyamory is a joke. It's actually people who like liberated sexual life, and who want to enjoy having sex with whoever they've got on board in their polyamory community. In effect, psychologically speaking, I would say it's a way of protecting yourself from intimacy. If you're really not capable of true intimacy, in which there's a melding of souls, anyone who's had especially true sexual intimacy will know that. There's a point in which you have lost yourself really with the soul of the person you are making love with. It's a wonderful feeling. I'm pretty sure animals don't have it. It's uniquely human. And I think it's pretty much ruined when you back off to the idea that you just want to have sex with whoever you want to have sex with, and you don't want to go that deeply into it. I think you lose something. You lose a lot. You actually lose the ultimate experience of human sexual love. The first question, I can't remember.
A little more about the second one first, and what will be the implications of having such a relationship in the long run? For example, when you wish to eventually raise family or children, what will be the potential outcome of such a setup?
Well, it's not impossible for polyamorous people to raise children together, but I think it's difficult, especially because young children tend to do their most powerful social bonding. I don't know whether that's your dog or mine, but
my dog. I apologize.
They tend to do their most powerful social bonding with their mothers. Initially, you're talking about breastfeeding, being on the breast and mother's milk, and the whole thing. And then I guess you'd say their fathers. This kind of social bonding is absolutely important. And child psychologists like Piaget, famous French psychologist named Piaget, who was studying all this business of bonding and attachment in children in the 50s and 60s, he basically said, if you don't supply the child with that singular bonding with its own mother, now its own mother, it's usually its own mother, but suppose the mother got killed in a war, like in Ukraine or something, somebody else can suckle the child and get the child to bond with them and all that, and try to supply that missing mother. But generally speaking, for most human beings, it's been the mother. And so in polyamory situations where I don't know what they're doing to raise the children, but they obviously are. They don't want the child to be bonded to only one person. It's like free love. Everybody counts. Everybody gets equal love. Everybody gets equal sex and all that kind of thing. Why? Because it doesn't mean as much as it would if it were restricted to a single human pair. Anyway, that's my view of it, and I think there's a lot of psychiatric and psychological evidence to back up the importance of attachment theory. If your listeners want to run and look for attachment theory, they'll find some very good writers who will tell you about the difficulties children get into who don't get that attachment. Now, the daycare center is a perfect facsimile of the polyamory situation. The kids are raised by whoever happens to be working there that day. Okay, sometimes it may be the same worker for a week or a month or even a year or whatever, who knows. But there's very high turnover in daycare workers. So the kid who manages to love the daycare worker because, good heavens, his mother drops him off at 7 o'clock and she's gone all day. He's not bonding with her, that's for sure, because when she comes back at 7 o'clock and picks him up and he's hungry and he's got a wet diaper and he's crying and she takes him home, changes him, feeds him and puts him to bed, or maybe tells him a little story, it's hardly adequate. So what happens is the kid bonds with the daycare center worker, and then the daycare center worker leaves and the kid's heart is broken. His heart is broken. And so what happens? Maybe he tries it again with the daycare worker who comes next. But when she leaves, twice, 2 strikes and you're out. Then he figures, I'm not going to bond with anybody. This business of love and bonding is dangerous. You can get hurt. You can get really hurt. So no thanks. It's not for me. And that's the way attachment theory goes. It basically speculates that with this rampant socialized daycare program that we have created in the Western democracies, worse in some countries than in others for sure, we have been creating millions upon millions of poorly attached human beings who have difficulty feeling the love for the other that they should feel if they were handled naturally by their own parents instead of shipped out to paid workers. End of that lecture.
Wow. That's so true. And we see that every day around us. That's why our society is so sick. The first question was, yes. How late are we? Is it still possible to turn the ship about wokeness and all the other different attacks on our conservative way of life? And what can be done to reverse it?
First of all, I think it's got to run its course. Right now, it's in the beginning part of it where they're all fired up. And they feel they are, how should I put it, soldiers of God, helping us all. And if we don't see that, we just need a little more education from them. In other words, they're in that preacherly mode, which you find in all these sorts of groups who have kind of delusions of theological and religious grandeur, which is what this is in a secular form. Until that starts to die out and they find themselves being criticized and pushed back by enough people, it's not going to change. Now, what do I mean? Last week in Toronto's National Post newspaper, there were 2 articles, one by an immigrant to Canada, and that's always very helpful because he came to Canada for Canada, and he wrote an article about wokeness as a new religion. What are you doing? What are you doing, folks? So perhaps some woke type people read that and went, wow, here's pushback coming from the bottom. Because they've been operating at the top. They get paid millions, if not billions, of fees for counseling corporations and especially government institutions on how to make their staff more woke. And these people they call human resources officers are their target. They get them to pull all the employees together. They give them big lectures on wokeism. And then they give them individual counseling sessions, where they try to teach them how to be more woke and to basically ask forgiveness for their blindness and all the rest of it. That is going on right now in every corporation I can think of, and every big bank in Canada. We have 5 huge banks. It's all there. I had an argument about this 2 weeks ago, and one of the directors of the corporation said, we've been doing that for a few years now. He said, we love it. He said, we love it. And well, he's on the woke side. He thinks it's great. And I said, you're not seeing the radical outcome down the road for your organization and for this society. and for basically the lying that's being carried on in terms of entry standards for universities and work in corporations, and the discrimination that's being carried on in the sense of not hiring people who simply don't agree with you. My own son applied for a job, I don't know, a while back, and he showed me the list of questions they asked. They were all like trying to get him to answer how woke he was on gender and color and race and ethnicity and everything else, which had nothing to do with the job that he wanted. You see, it was like a examination of the purity of his soul by a church or a religious organization. Do you actually belong in this church? Well, we got to ask you a few questions. For example, in Christian organizations, they will often ask you these questions specifically tailored to their own type of religious offering. So if they're Baptists, they'll ask you to swear to a covenant that you believe in this and you believe in that. Even if you're one of the greatest, say, workers in the world, they won't hire you unless you sign that covenant. Well, it's happening with wokeness. You're being asked to sign an attestation, and it's backfiring, like in the case of the Legal Society. It's called the Law Society of Ontario, 60,000 members. It took that many, managed to fire the board and replace them on the grounds that you can preach what you want, but don't tell us what to think or what to say, especially outside when we leave work. Stop thinking you can dictate our lifestyle to us. So that was great, but it's got to happen everywhere. It's got to happen. My own son went into his public school where his kids were bringing home woke books about how Susie has two moms and all that kind of stuff, all the homosexual stuff, which is being rammed down their throats. The private school that my own kids and my grandkids have gone to, some of them is flying the gay flag on the flagpole now. Everybody thinks it's great. I mean, in the school. If you try to argue with them, talk to the principal or the headmaster of the school, he just shuts you down as a damn racist or whatever right off the bat without even hearing your arguments. You know, that maybe there are arguments that toleration is okay, sir, but normalization is not. You're trying to normalize the abnormal. And I don't think that's great for kids in your classroom. You know, teaching people toleration is a religious thing to do in most religions. But to normalize the abnormal is a bizarre overreach. And it's happening everywhere throughout our societies. If you look at, for example, what was banned in Canada just 50 years ago, and the things that are encouraged now, there's a whole list of a dozen of them, things that were banned. Divorce was very difficult. Very hard to get a divorce here 50 years ago. Marijuana was banned 50 years ago. Are you kidding? You're going to go to jail, and so on. Pornography, I mean, you could probably find it if you looked hard enough, but it certainly wasn't in every hotel room or all over the internet. For even a child to dial up on the cell phone, when that's a friggin' disgrace, and I tell you what, it's never been discussed. There's been no public discussion in Canada about the prevalence of pornography and how available it is on even a very young child's cell phone. No discussion. I mean, that is astonishing that an entire society that prides itself on being adult and mature and to have the care of millions of youngsters in its hands has said absolutely nothing about that truth, that reality.
It's very sad. William, I would like to thank you as usual. What will be our topic for next Wednesday?
Well, next Wednesday, I'd like to talk about something I brought up a couple of decades ago, but is still more than ever true. And it shocks people when I give them the title of that paper. It's Democracy Against the Family. It's the idea that egalitarian democracy, as it has become, not as it originally was, but as it has become, is a very anti-family political system. And we need to recognize that and do something about it. So I look forward to chatting with you next week.
Yes, me too. And thank you very much. I'm going to post the video of this presentation in about 2 or 3 minutes, so you can find it in the group. And I will also send it to you in private. And this time it will be properly recorded and useful for you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and see you
Bye.
next Wednesday. Bye for now.